Your Grace, Reverend Fathers, esteemed members of the seminary faculty, students, and honored guests. Welcome to St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, and welcome to this academic event celebrating the legacy of Father John Meyendorff, a centennial tribute. I was thinking and starting to write my remarks a couple of times during this past week, but then I was asking myself, shall I stay dry and just read something from a paper, or should I be emotional, talking about a person that I never met? And finally, I decided to be emotional, so bear with me. Give me comfort if I need that. I have two major ideas that I want to share with you. Number one is something that happened in 1996 when I started my undergrad degree at the University of Bucharest. And that was the moment when a major book, Byzantine theology, of Father John Meyendorff, was translated into Romanian. And that was a book that really changed my life. And this is why I want to share this moment with you. I was passionate about dogmatics, very passionate about dogmatics. But when I read this book, I was thinking, okay, it's not only about dogmas, it's about how you craft those dogmas, how you can explain what happened in the 4th century or in the 5th or in the 6th. And I like very much the way that Father John, into a translation in marginal language in Europe, expressed that. And then, obviously, as a student in theology, I start being more and more at home with his research dedicated to the 14th century, hesychasm. But not only hesychasm, one of the articles that I really like was the one published in Dumbarton Oaks Papers in French. It was a time when Dumbarton Oaks Papers published pieces in French at the end of the 60s about the project of the Ecumenical Council in 1367, I think, because I happened to work on a little bit on the 14th century and the theological controversies between Rome and Constantinople, and that was a major piece at that time. So somehow that reading shifted my attention from dogmatics to Byzantine theology. We had a professor in Bucharest that also helped me to spark my interest and move forward with this in 96, 97, 98, and so on. Being now here, it's a joy, it is an opportunity, but also is daunting. To step on the footsteps of major figures is very scary. I understand how much I need to work and build and maintain the reputation of the school, how much I need to continue to push myself for not comparing, but at least trying to maintain that reputation that Father George Florovsky, Father Alexander Zmeman, and Father John Meyendorff created for this school. This was number one on my list today. Number two is how we ended up having this beautiful gathering today. It was a year ago when I had a dinner with George and Telly and Father Bogdan, and we were talking about how we can have a cooperation between our two schools. And George came up with this idea. He said that we should do something together in relation to this centennial from the birth of Father John. And right away, we came up with a list. We decided how to do it. It was very clear that a panihida would happen at St. Vladimir's Chapel, a place very dear to Father John. I heard how he was crossing the campus from his office in the education building, coming to the service 1 minute before because he was working on something. So he was not sparing time for this. So obviously the Panihida needed to happen in the place that he loved. And we were thinking about this tribute to happen also here. More academic presentation are going to be at Fordham tomorrow on the campus in the Bronx. So I'm very happy. I'm honored to welcome all of you. I think it's a great event. I think we were capable to line up the best scholars who can deal, who can assess, and who can remember Father John Meyendorff and his legacy. Now I'm stepping in my other role to moderate this evening, and therefore I have to introduce His Grace, Bishop Irinej. His Grace did his studies at St. Tikhon Seminary in Pennsylvania, but also continued at St. Vladimir Seminary here under the leadership of Father Alexander Schmemann and Father John Meyendorff. And Bishop Irinej is a dear friend of this school, remained a dear friend of this school throughout the years, although he happened to spend some time in Australia and then he came back. Now he's serving as a trustee of the seminary, and I am very pleased and very honored to welcome you, Your Grace, to be the first speaker of the night. Thank you.
Thank you most kindly, our eminent and very respected Dean of St. Vladimir's Seminary, Dr. Tudorie, very reverend, and venerable clergy, distinguished members of the faculty, cherished members of Father John's family, sisters and brothers, students, staff, and faculty alike. It is indeed my distinct honor and pleasure to stand before you and offer but a few impoverished words about the legacy of Father John Meyendorff through my own personal experience. The great psalmist, King David, poses a question of old before the Lord, which reverberates throughout the ages to our very day. What is man that you are mindful of him? The Serbian Prince Bishop and poet of Montenegro, Petar Petrović II Njegoš, responds, and in turn immortalizes the same in his 1847 epic poem, cum national drama, The Mountain Wreath. Blago onom koji do vijeka živi, imao se rašta I roditi. Blessed is he who lives forever, for he had reason to be born. Indeed, this gives us cause and comprehension for this solemn memorial celebration honoring the centennial of the birth of one, John Meyendorff, born in France on February 17th, 1926. For such a person, through the magnitude of his life and legacy, truly lives forever and had reason to be born. For such it is that we in Orthodoxy sing, as we did this very evening, Memory Eternal. Following suit, the exceedingly charismatic Alexander Schmemann, former dean and professor at St. Vladimir Seminary, and if I may dare add, my confessor, whom Father John so brilliantly eulogized, summarizing Father Alexander's life and legacy, even by title alone, A Life Worth living. Once stated, every human encounter, regardless of how long or brief, leaves its indelible mark on a person's soul, which they bear with them into eternity. Thereby, the most enduring gift an educator can offer a student is that of self, freely given through their life, lectures, mentorship, and profound writings. This unique gift of an indelible seal, that of interpersonal relations and self-offering, is one that Father John Meyendorff so readily bestowed upon all from the rich font of his life in Christ. Such was the inspired insight of this erudite scholar that embraced the vast experience of his profound historic, patristic, and ecclesiological witness to orthodoxy, indeed, an educator par excellence. Sensing my own inadequacy to present a reflection that is far less than all embracing on the person and magnitude of John Meyendorff, kindly allow me this brief introductory presentation to serve as precisely that, an entree to these 2 days, which have been set aside at St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary and Fordham University in remembrance of a truly Renaissance individual and, as noted, one of the most influential Orthodox theologians of the 20th century. I dare present from personal knowledge garnered and remembrance of him as one of his students under whose guidance, as a second reader, together with my mentor, Dr. Veselin Kesic, I wrote my Master of Divinity thesis, Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, aspects of his 1921 missionary activities in America. Father John's classes were awe-inspiring in a most unique way, as they were quite exhilarating, replete with a vast array of intense knowledge, presenting both the broad spectrum and zeroing in at times on pertinent, telling detail. Scholar that he was, with exceedingly profound knowledge, and one would dare to say near first-hand experience of the historic persons of whom he spoke or events on which he lectured. For he presented with such piercing perception as though he had come to know the person of whom he spoke or was physically located at a particular historic event. For he casually and with such ease seemingly reminisced as mere matter of fact with fascinating insight. Often it had the guise of being as though he had walked away from a raging medieval battle, dining with a Byzantine emperor, or discussing a particular topic with a lucid church father. Subsequently, I was much pleased to have discovered, reminiscent of Father John's particular lecturing style, expressed in terms of sharp observation and vivid details, with a similar personal note of casually presented depth of knowledge in the narrative historic writings of Byzantinist John Julius Lord Norwich, aptly described by Peter Levi in The Independent as a brilliant but not superficial, unflaggingly entertaining. Such were his classes. Professor Meyendorff played a critical role in what has come to be known as the neo-patristic movement, championed by Father George Florovsky as the neo-patristic synthesis. Gratefully, this has earned St. Vladimir Seminary a critical and crucial role in the awakening and revival of orthodoxy, particularly here in the West. For many of us, It was indeed an exceedingly grateful epoch in which to have studied orthodoxy, literally regaining self, in everything from teachings to ecclesiastical arts and liturgy notwithstanding. Doors and windows that had been academically, artistically, and liturgically shuttered were now open to a magnificent new spring. For a new day had dawned in a revival which shattered the shackles of what Florovsky termed, quote unquote, the Western captivity of the Eastern mind. As it were, repartee during my tenure at St. Vladimir's Seminary as a student. As Robert Browning notes in his introduction to the Byzantine Empire, no longer were the likes of Edward Gibbon in his book Decline and Fall to dismiss in the pejorative the rich 1,000-year history of Byzantium, quote unquote, as the triumph of barbarism and Christianity. However, unlike the West, Byzantium never succumbed to the Dark Ages, rather morphing from one golden era to the next. Such was the liberating effect of Meyendorff's publications, Byzantine Theology, Historical Trends and Doctrinal Themes, and the Byzantine Legacy in the Orthodox Church. While ongoing titles, such as the Orthodox Church, did not shy away from reviving the image of orthodoxy following the fall of communism and the new opportunities it presented to the witness of the Orthodox churches of Eastern Europe to the West and before the world. In great part, this pioneering work of Protopresbyter John Meyendorff was due to his admirable Russo-Parisian inheritance, wherein his understanding of ecclesiology was an integral part of the neo-patristic revival, a clear wellspring of St. Sergius Orthodox Theological Institute, come the oldest institution of Orthodox theology in Western Europe. This pioneering ecclesiology, indeed Eucharistic ecclesiology, is considered by Orthodox scholars, the likes of Aristotle, Papa Nicolaou, in the mystical as political, democracy and non-radical orthodoxy, to have first emerged with Nicholas Afanasiev, the influence of which was evidenced in the writing of his successors, profound Orthodox intellectuals, religious philosophers, and theologians, the likes of Florovsky, Schmemann, and of course, Meyendorff, among others, constituting now, in great part, the indisputable inheritance of St. Vladimir's Seminary. As priest and professor, John Meyendorff clearly articulated the integral nature of the sacramental life of the Church through the now influential perspective of Eucharistic ecclesiology, which imbues the entirety of the Orthodox ecclesiastical corpus, as is exemplified in his book, Marriage, an Orthodox Perspective. Here, we are able to witness, as with the teachings of Alexander Schmemann on liturgy and baptism, how Father John reintroduces the concept of liturgical marriage. Quote, in the liturgy, the Church, being concretely a gathering of people, ceases to be a human organization and becomes truly the Church of God. Then, Christ himself leads the assembly, and the assembly is transformed into his body. Then all partitions between concrete historical happenings and eternity are broken. Now, the Church teaches us that marriage is a sacrament in as much as it happens in the framework of the Eucharistic divine liturgy, end quote. Truly an ongoing lesson for today. Finally, I would be entirely remiss if I did not delve in to Father John's ongoing and positive influence on our contemporary Orthodox understanding of spirituality. Through the revival of the teachings in person of St. Gregory Palamas, 14th century Archbishop of Thessaloniki, which bears with it as prelude the theological poetic genius of St. Simeon, the new theologian, imbued with the light of Christ, which illumines all. With this, the ethos of transfiguration resumed its proper and just place as the very essence of iconography and architecture among all else, the visible hallmarks of orthodoxy. In turn, this led to the newest among Orthodox academic disciplines, the theology and ethics of beauty, sparked by Dostoevsky in his famous, albeit enigmatic, quote, "Beauty will save the world," as well as Orthodox Christian anthropology. In conclusion, we have gathered at this centennial commemoration to honor and to remember Protopresbyter John Meyendorff, a revered theologian, scholar, and priest, whose profound contributions have left their indelible mark on the Orthodox Christian faith and academia. Born in 1926, he dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge and the deepening of faith, embodying the spirit of a true servant of God. A distinguished professor and dean of St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, Father John was indeed instrumental in bridging the wealth of multifaceted Byzantine theology with contemporary issues facing the church and society. His scholarly works have shaped our understanding of Orthodox theology and its application in today's complex world. He was not just a theologian. He was also a pastor known for his warmth, wisdom, and unwavering commitment to the spiritual care of his community. His ability to communicate complex theological ideas with clarity and perfect compassion will continue to inspire countless scholars, students, and lay persons alike. He believed very much so in the power of dialogue and worked tirelessly to foster relationships that enriched Orthodox Christian witness in a diverse society, evidenced now at both St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary and the Orthodox Christian Studies Centers at Fordham University. As we remember Father John Meyendorff, we celebrate a life devoted to Christ, education, and the church. His legacy lives on through his writings, his students, and the countless lives he touched and will touch. May his memory continue to inspire us to seek truth, pursue love, and to follow the path of Christ.
Thank you, Your Grace, for this beautiful history combined with some memories of Father John. Watching you, hearing you, I was imagining him out of this campus. Thank you. It's my pleasure now to invite our second speaker, Dr. Vera Shevzov. And I have to say that I just met Vera a couple of weeks ago. And I was checking the library at one point, and I noticed that it's someone that I don't know. And it was Vera looking avidly for some different materials and papers. And then I opened the doors of the archive for her, and she was very, very happy. So I'm curious to see and to hear from Vera, to learn about Father John from the OCA and the seminary archive. Vera, please.
Yes, Your Grace, and Reverend Fathers, faculty, students, honored guests, thank you so much for everyone coming. And I have to say, I'm very honored to have been invited by Dean Tudorie. So sorry. He tells me to call him Dean Alex. And to the Fordham Center, George Demokopoulos, and Telly for helping to organize this two-day event, which I think is amazing. And I'm very, again, honored to be participating in this remembrance on the special occasion of Father John's 100th anniversary of his birth. My memories are going to be a little bit different and in part, you know, it's been 30 years has passed since Father John's unexpected death, and more than 40 years since I arrived at St. Vladimir's as an MDiv student in 1983 at the young age of 23. Much has happened since then, and as we know, time inevitably takes its toll on memory. Father John was both my academic mentor and confessor, yet in preparing for this event, I felt I needed in a sense, really to hear his voice again and to reawaken long dormant memories in order to find words adequate to express the imprint he left on me, not only as a student, but later as a historian and teacher, but more importantly, as an Orthodox Christian. So in addition to returning to his publications and even to his notes, which I have kept all these years, I have all of his lecture notes, I immersed myself in his archive thanks to the generous help of Dean Alex and the wonderful librarian Deacon Andrew. And that experience revivified much of what I had already known, yet it also revealed much I did not. Most of all, I was reminded just how extensive Father John's reach and influence truly were. The countless people literally scattered around the world who were shaped by his mentorship, friendship, and by his decades of tireless service to the church. Even if considering only his students, when I went through the lists, which we went through together, remember we saw those lists of students that he taught at St. Vladimir's, the knowledge that I was only one of hundreds became very palpable. And to grasp the full scope of his legacy would require gathering all of us here, all of his students together, to see our diversity and to hear the full range of our stories. I can only hope that my brief reflections will capture something of what so many others also received from him. But we need to begin with some context. My path to St. Vladimir's was circuitous and unexpected, to say the least. I was raised in an old Russian emigre family who, like Father John, came to the United States in the late 1950s. And I learned about him, or rather heard his name, in the late 60s and 70s in discussions about the church, which were very common during long Sunday afternoon lunches after liturgy. And I would hear this word autocephaly often injected. For an 8-year or 10-year-old, little of it made sense, of course, yet what remained indelible were the deep emotions those conversations stirred. Whatever was being discussed, even at that young age, I sensed they involved the ultimate questions that I could not yet identify. Both my parish and my family were casualties of those debates that consumed many metropolia, or later OCA-affiliated parishes in the 1970s. But all I recall is that one day I was standing in what was yet another Orthodox church in the same town, a newly formed parish created when part of our original community split off and aligned itself with what was then called the Church Abroad, now referred to as ROCOR. Years passed, my father, a chemist by profession, who eventually was ordained a deacon and then a priest, I knew Orthodoxy primarily as it was lived by these emigres, none of whom, I must emphasize, and even my old believer grandfather, were anything like the portrayals in intra-Orthodox polemics and stereotypes. My parents never spoke about not taking communion in other Orthodox churches, and as a child, before my father was ordained, we occasionally attended Antiochian or Greek parishes when traveling, or for instance, when living temporarily in places where there just simply were no other churches but an Antiochian or a Greek church. Even these frequent experiences as a child instilled in me the sense that faith and ethnic identity were distinct and that the former mattered far more than the latter. I entered college with a host of questions, as young people do, which in my case drew me to courses in the history of Russia and the USSR and to Slavic languages and cultures. And I was interested in Orthodoxy's imprint in Russia's history and culture, and in what led to the 1917 revolution and civil war. It's sort of a story in one's roots, I suppose, and exploration. Yet how to pursue these questions and where to look was not self-evident to me at that time, in part because I couldn't yet fully define what it was I was searching for. As I was reminded over these past weeks while reviewing Father John's writings, when he arrived in the United States in 1959, he already valued higher education and understood its importance for creating culture, a culture in which Orthodoxy, especially as a minority religion in this country, could take root, quote, outside of its historical environment, as he put it, and that it could thrive. As an editor of the newspaper, The Orthodox Church, a remarkable publication for its time. I really encourage everyone to go back and read that paper. I was really amazed at how sophisticated it was, in fact. Father John addressed the problem of Orthodoxy's underrepresentation as an academic subject in America's colleges and universities. He encouraged parents to have their daughters and sons search broadly across the curriculum for courses that might have an Orthodox component. If none existed, he urged students to be proactive and ask their deans about this. Insofar as Orthodoxy was a part of American culture, he wrote, its study could and should find a place in the college curriculum. And this is 1965 we're talking about. When I graduated in 1982, I felt compelled to pursue the history of Orthodoxy and the Orthodox Church in Russia, but didn't know where to go to do this. Where were the best place to be? Should I apply, for instance, to a history program or a religious studies program? At the time, St. Vladimir's was not on my radar at all. I had heard of it, of course, and within the circle of our family friends, it was spoken of very highly. But it had never occurred to me that it was anything other than a place to train clergy. Deciding to take a gap year to weigh further paths, I embarked on a year of study in Leningrad State University. Ironically, it was there in Leningrad that Orthodox believers living under the Soviet regime first introduced me, as it were, to St. Vladimir's and encouraged me to study there and especially seek out Father John. Father John's reach into Soviet Russia forms an important part of his legacy. It extended beyond the clergy he met through his involvement in the World Council of Churches or members of an official church delegations with whom he interacted here in the US and in Europe in the 1960s, especially in preparation for the autocephaly agreement. As a scholar, he also cultivated lifelong ties with Byzantinists and Soviet scholars who were medievalists, both men and women. He has a correspondence already with them in the 60s and 70s, and whom he met at international conferences, and some of whom were deeply committed Orthodox believers, it turns out. In 1978, for instance, while attending an academic conference in Leningrad, the renowned medievalist Dmitry Likhachov entrusted Father John with sacred relics that had been passed down to him for safekeeping by yet another scholar who in turn had received them from a bishop in a Gulag camp. After the fall of the Soviet Union, yet before he had died, Father John had ensured that these relics be returned to Russia. And that letter to Metropolitan Theodosius is in Father John's archive. Likhachov wrote a letter about this episode to the then Patriarch Alexei right after Father John died to sort of memorialize this episode, and it's now available on the Moscow Danilov Monastery's website where these relics are kept. Perhaps more significantly, Father John was staunchly committed to defending believers who struggled for survival, physical and spiritual, under Soviet rule. Even during the years when negotiating and trying to secure autocephaly, when all these talks had begun, Father John remained adamant that the church here could not relinquish its freedom and forfeit its responsibilities to believers living in the USSR. Beginning with the first issue of the Orthodox Church in 1965, Father John consistently devoted attention to the plight of these believers. Alongside news from American parishes and reports from Orthodox communities from around the world, Cyprus, Ethiopia, Greece, Kenya, Western Europe, just to name a few, and from other Christian churches in the U.S., he made a point of publishing in every issue stories that revealed pressures and persecutions endured by Orthodox Christians under the Soviet regime. In 1966, he published the letters of two priests who exposed the mechanisms of state control over the church and criticized church hierarchs for their compliance. And all of this published despite the delicate negotiations that had begun with regarding autocephaly with the church, with the Moscow Patriarchate. I learned only recently that even after autocephaly was eventually granted, Father John himself was barred in the late 1970s from entering the Soviet Union for almost a decade because of his personal connections with Orthodox clergy, such as Father Alexander Main, who at the time were considered subversives by the state, of course. As late as 1986, during Gorbachev's perestroika, and this is actually sort of humorous, even though I'm sure for Father John it wasn't, a Soviet newspaper, Trud, Labor, 1986, that's not that long ago, publicly denounced him for meeting with well-known Orthodox clergy such as Alexander Main years earlier. Father John was sort of implicated as being a CIA kind of agent or something. As we know, the plot. Even in the limited capacity in which I knew him, Father John impressed me. Given all of this, reading this, it just brought back that memory that he was a person of extraordinary integrity, a man who chose principle over power. He had those negotiations for autocephaly, and here he is publishing this stuff. And he really did. He chose principle over power, and that quality drew so many people to him, including myself. It was a lifelong lesson. So back to how I ever got to St. Vladimir. So I returned from Leningrad in the summer of 1983, and I set about applying. Well, it didn't go very smoothly because first of all, the application deadline had passed. And then after I sort of gotten that settled, I couldn't find a ROCOR priest willing to overlook jurisdictional divisions to write me a letter of recommendation. It took me a while, and I did finally find my childhood priest, and I have to give him credit, Father Victor Potapov. Thank you very much, Father Victor. So when I was finally accepted and arrived at the seminary in the fall of 1983, I was initially met also, it was a little tough at first with a mix of caution and curiosity. A couple faculty members were wondering about my Eucharistic intentions. Would I take communion or not? Had to go for a couple walks, but it's okay. It was fine. I was a little surprised, but not only because why would I come if I wasn't going to take communion? Anyway, and some of my fellow students weren't really sure either why I was here, given my profile, but not Father John. He was completely unfazed. He welcomed me warmly and understood everything at once. I'll never forget our first meeting. By his very demeanor and by the way he spoke with me, he communicated that I was in the right place and that my vocational path was no less important than anyone else's here at the seminary. And from then on, it felt really good to be here. It's probably the best years of my formative years of my life. Indeed, one of my Father John's most enduring legacies was his profound commitment to study, learning, and scholarship. And when I came to St. Vladimir's, the seminary's mission was to explicitly stated to be twofold: to prepare educated clergy for service to the church and to foster academic study and research in Orthodox theology, history, and culture. For Father John's obvious deep commitment to studying and teaching, these were intrinsic to his broader ecclesial vision. The pursuit of knowledge, especially the knowledge of the past, were essential for maintaining the living continuity of tradition. It was integral to his identity and vocation, not only as a priest, but as an Orthodox Christian. Moreover, he understood that America's colleges and university were a natural and essential seedbed for Orthodox visibility as a minority religion in this country, and its gradual integration into America's rich and diverse cultural landscape. So, though Father John developed strong affiliations with places such as Harvard's Dumbarton Oaks Center and Fordham University, he always considered St. Vladimir as his primary home. The seminary's dual mission, preparing clergy and promoting serious academic study, shaped his entire vocation here. And for me, that second aspect has always been especially meaningful. When I was reviewing these issues of the Orthodox Church, I really got into that newspaper. I was really struck by a 1965 headline. Actually, I think it was the second issue of the newspaper, 1965, and the headline was "Symposium at St. Vladimir's Attracts Educators from Many Universities," and I found that quite amazing. And there were professors from and faculty from all over, University of Michigan, University of Kansas, even Mount Holyoke College, which is in my neighborhood, from Harvard, from I think even from Berkeley. They were from everywhere. It was a small but telling reminder of how deliberately Father John worked to connect the seminary with the broader academic community. Years later, I encountered another sign of that legacy in a book that I was reading by the scholar Judith Kornblatt, written in 2004, entitled "Doubly Chosen: A Landmark Study of Soviet Religious Dissidents." In her preface to the book, she wrote, "I began to study the history, doctrine, and ritual of the Orthodox Church in graduate school at Columbia University and as a special student at St. Vladimir Seminary. My early teachers in Russian Orthodoxy, was one of whom was the late Father John Meyendorff, deserve credit for setting me on the path to this study." And then she went on in a lengthy footnote to state explicitly that St. Vladimir's was founded with this dual mission of theological scholarship and education, and that it was there that she found Father John and worked with him. Her acknowledgement speaks volumes about the role he played in bringing the study of Orthodoxy into America's classrooms. I often wonder how many such non-degree special students, such as Judith Kornblatt, passed through St. Vladimir's during his 33 years here. Students whose lives he shaped, and scholars whose lives he shaped, and other professionals, lawyers, doctors, I'm sure, that he met and taught, and whose names remain largely unknown. As a teacher, mentor, and author, he helped form generations of scholars who taught and still teach about Orthodox Christianity in universities and colleges, not only in theological departments at faith-based schools, but also in religious studies, history, Slavic studies, art history, and other fields, all within secular environments. And beyond these teachers stand the countless students they, in turn, have taught. Given Father John's many other responsibilities as a laborer in the vineyard, so to say, this academic mission was no small feat. Some of his closest friends described it endearingly as his uchonly podvig, so his scholarly feat or efforts, right? And often the silent labor that and tireless efforts that stand behind that. As is widely known, from the time of from its founding in 1938, the seminary looked to America's div schools primarily as models for St. Vladimir's own long-term success. They took it from where you are, you look at the environment and model your school accordingly. As Father John stated on numerous occasions, it was imperative for Orthodox clergy to have the same level of education as their counterparts in America's other religious traditions. At the same time, Father John also considered theological schools a vital and irreplaceable element in the chain of tradition. And so if you look at catalogs of St. Vladimir's, often, I don't know if it's today or not, it's still there, but at least when I was here, it was noted that the seminary's founders sought to, quote, reestablish in America the traditions of Russia's four theological academies, where prior to the revolution, bishops, clergy, scholars, and church leaders received their education. Now, it's noteworthy that Father John highly valued that legacy, whether, he talked about it or not. I don't actually remember him talking about it at all in classrooms or anything. Do you? I don't remember that at all, being sort of part of the, part of the sort of milieu. But he did value it. And he commented on it on numerous occasions in various, articles or speaking engagements, and he looked to those sources as largely an untapped body of material, especially in fields of patristics and church history that have been left unnoticed, and how few scholars, he bemoaned, today really understand the scholarship, the enriched scholarship that those four theological academies produced. So it's interesting. As part of my education here, we decided that he would. I worked with him on two semesters of special studies where we focused on Orthodoxy in Russia. And in one of them, the goal was to read Florovsky's The Ways of Russian Theology. And I was 23. And I came in and I tried those first few weeks, right? And I didn't understand anything. I didn't understand anything. But I knew Russian. And so he says to me, he saw I was just, totally can't. And I just said, I think he's arguing all the time and he's angry at something. And I just don't understand what's he arguing against, and Father, son, he seemed a little like, okay, we have to go back to the sources. So he sent me, and this is where it began. He sent me on this, sort of mission to tap the theological journals, all those, of the theological academies. And it was really quite interesting. And that's what my senior thesis was on, we chose one, and I just sort of spent a year just, really reading every issue and sort of putting together a thesis from it. And after that in graduate school, I continued with that and went through several of them in that kind of detail. At the same time, it's very interesting. So if he had received that lineage from Saint Serge and then came to America with that, when he returned to Russia either right before the fall or right after the fall of the Soviet Union, 91, 92. He was actually there in 91 when all that commotion started. He was serving liturgy with the Patriarch Alexis in the Dormition Cathedral when the tanks started coming in, during that putsch in 91. In any case, when he was lecturing, I noticed in Russia, I was reading his lectures recently, the few that he did or that are preserved that he gave. The first ones were actually at the Theological Academies, not in Russia, but in Minsk. And he always spoke of St. Vladimir's as a theological academy, I guess, to make it understandable to them what St. Vladimir's was. And he, in fact, has been listed in sort of the legacy of the great theologians starting from these theological academies, the great names, and then, they come down through the decades, and you'll see Father John listed by scholars in countries from the former Soviet Union. Yet it's interesting, Father John I never saw anywhere where he put himself in that lineage. And it shows who Father John was. When speaking in Minsk in 1992, the spring before he passed away, he said to the student body and to the clergy present that you have before you a person who speaks Russian but was born in France, educated in the West, and spent his entire life in the pluralistic and diverse and religious and secular Western world. Therefore, I think as an Orthodox Christian, my own experience in the West may be partly of interest to you. And we really should work together. So it's not like he came back and said, I'm really the authentic one here. How some emigres do that when they go back to, especially after the fall. So he never had that. He recognized who he was, and he had gone through an entirely different historical path and had gained something as an Orthodox Christian, which again, he felt he could share. In any case, I just want to end with just a few, for someone who so profoundly have quietly shaped, my own vision and my, how would you say, formation as a scholar and an Orthodox Christian. I just want to sort of highlight a few of the most important. First and foremost, as I said, I was searching, what am I supposed to, what am I to study? What's the subject? What am I looking for? Well, Father John is the one who clarified it, the church. Except for Father John, church really meant something very different than for most other people when you use that use that term. And he was very clear about it. It was not, his vision of the church, that included liturgical practice and sacramental discipline and canon law. What do they manifest? That's, he was looking for what was manifested, it wasn't in the hierarchy, it wasn't in clergy, he followed the spirit of Irinej, where the spirit is, there is the church, and where the church is, there is the spirit of God. And so, he believed in this, and he really, even in his own scholarship, he always followed that spirit, right? That's what he was tracing in anything he did. And I remember one of his students who was teaching, I think now at St. Sergius, always said that even his historical scholarship was very theological. His writing purely as a historian. It was actually, if you look through it, he was looking for, it was said something deeper. So we had this very holistic approach, and one that weighed everything from an ecclesiological point of view. In a 1992 interview, it was very interesting. In his last interview that was given in post-Soviet Russia, he said that the Russian Orthodox believers never identified the church as such, no offense, with public statements or behavior of the hierarchy. Because people of the church in liturgy and lived experience and of the kingdom to come, he said, they find this, they find the church in other places, right? They find it not necessarily only in their clergy and hierarchy. So church to him was, a very different term that is usually used. And that stayed with me forever. And it makes it hard. It makes it hard to live sometimes, when you're anticipating this church as Father John saw it. In any case, it inspired everything he did, and he didn't make my task easier or simpler, but just pointed me in the right direction. He also attributed to the fathers of the church something very important that he taught me, and that's the importance of creative work of discernment. And that's a phrase that appears over and over in his writings. He also taught me the need to have, to perfect translation skills. And he's not talking about languages. He's talking about, again, referring to the fathers, that we have to imitate their constant effort to understand their contemporaries and to use words and concepts that would truly communicate and reach the minds of the listeners. And this has been especially important to me as a professor of religious studies in a secular institution, the importance of knowing the language of those to whom you are speaking and speaking and conveying truths and understandings of very deep issues in the language that these students will understand and articulate these ways of knowing and seeing, which are foreign to them, but in ways that they can grasp. He also taught me that history and theology are inseparable. Theology cannot be good theology, cannot be done without history, deep historical knowledge, and history without theology is empty. He had a biblical view of history. God works in history. History for him was also not about the past. It was also about the future and most importantly, about the present. Things are complicated, Father John always reminded me. He was against simplification and reduction. In a 1984 interview, he once said that in America, where there is so much vitality, what is disturbing are the trends to oversimplify. This is a real danger of American society. For example, fundamentalism is a simplification, and so is liberalism. There is immaturity and oversimplification in all of this. So if anyone knows, so anyone here who knows me can see where some of my sometimes rants come from. In any case, he also taught me that a purely preservationist path can lead to mummification, right? And he warned about sclerosis, right? Sclerosis of the church, sclerosis of the liturgy. This is why you have to know history, because you can see then naturally things change, things develop, things progress. But that doesn't mean that that precisely that essential spirit is in any way compromised or lost. The point is to discern and to see. And he was also against abstractions. You know, he said you could not speak about church and state in general, for example. He goes, it depends what state you're talking about, right? You just can't say, what is the Orthodox understanding of the relations of church and state? What state, right? And he again, these are the kinds of things he would just challenge you on. And finally, he believed in miracles, which actually, I guess it sort of did surprise me. The number of times I met that in the letters that he had exchanged in the archive, you know, that this idea, he really believed that when autocephaly was granted, it was really a miracle, that he didn't anticipate at all that what had taken place would take place, that it would. He also writes that everything is is complex. Life is complex, but only subordine razum, how would you say, like a conciliar? I guess it's really conciliar, but it's like this, the conciliar wisdom, the communal wisdom of the community, and authentic miracles can direct us on the correct path, can direct us onto the right path. He got depressed sometimes in his writings. I don't know if anyone's read his writings when those talks, when it was disappointing sometimes, things didn't always go the way he thought. And if you know Father John's ecclesial vision, it was hard not to understand why everyone it was so, to me at least, it was such common sense and so self-evident. And it was hard to understand why there was all this resistance constantly. But in any case, I just want to end that I could say so much more, but as I see my time's done. So I do want to say the last thing. When he was, again, lecturing in Minsk and thinking back on the dreams that St. Sergius Institute founders had for their school, he recalled that many were not fulfilled, of course, in the material sense, but what did survive, the books produced, the writings produced, and the spiritual connections were far more significant. A spiritual and intellectual legacy is one that will undoubtedly bear fruit. And I think in Father John's case, yes, he has left us a very strong spiritual and intellectual vision. And though he may not have lived to see his ecclesial vision realized in America, I do think that that vision and legacy is going to push forward until it is realized. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shevzov. You had so many brilliant ideas that you shared with us. St. Vladimir's as an academy, St. Vladimir's as a hub for scholars, the vision that he had for the school, the vision he had for the church. But I will just say one word about your life and this beautiful invitation he launched to you in 1983. Let's go to the primary sources. It seems that you are still stuck into that since my meeting with you happened at the archive. Thank you. It's my great honor to invite now someone that needs no introduction, at least here, but I think beyond St. Vladimir Seminary, Dr. Paul Meyendorff, please.
Thank you very much. Your Grace, fathers, colleagues, students, guests, it's good to be back. I grew up here from age 8. I returned as a student in seminary after college. I went to grad school and came back and taught for 30 years and retired now 10 years ago. So this is my home. I entitled my talk, Getting to Know Father John. So I'm going to be on a very different wavelength than what you've heard so far. He was born in Paris. He wore a dress and had long hair till he was 6 years old, because that was the style in those days. His parents were Russian emigres who came to France, along with probably 1 million others, and had to survive. And how they survived was that my grandfather, who had graduated from the cadet school, military school in Russia, was an artillery officer stationed in Finland during the revolution. He had to make a living. And what he did was he became a miniaturist. He painted miniature portraits in watercolor on ivory. And that's what he did for his whole life. And his wife, my grandmother, was his executor. She was the go-getter. She was a very strong personality, and she would go beat the bushes in high society in France, because those were expensive little trinkets, that only the rich could afford. And he made his whole life in France was doing this, while my father was raised by a nanny who had an equally strong character. She would address my grandmother as Baranyesa, meaning goat, as opposed to baroness. So it was and she lived with my parents. I remember her. When I was a child, she was still living with my grandparents long after my father had left home. So it was a very interesting situation. Anyway, my father then grew up in France, went to school in France. During the war, he was still a teenager. They were in Biarritz in southwest France, because that was another center of French high society, and they would always go spend the whole summers there. So they happened to be there when the Germans invaded, and they stayed there. My father grew up there, went to school, elementary school, high school. He learned Greek and Latin in elementary school. The French education system in those days was still good. I still give students advice. If you want to go to grad school, you want to pursue higher studies, learn languages, as many as you can, as early as you can, and there's no better time than elementary school. After the war, my father entered the seminary, St. Sergius. And then after graduating from seminary, he began teaching there very quickly as he was pursuing his studies at the Sorbonne, ended up with his doctorate in Gregory, the writings of Gregory Palamas. Now, while he was there studying, beginning to teach, he was also very much involved in the life of the local church. He was active in the youth movement. He was active in what was the beginnings of the ecumenical movement, when there was still no ecumenical movement. Back in those days before Vatican II, Roman Catholics were not permitted, even allowed to meet with non-Catholics. with Orthodox or Protestants. And so he recalled secret meetings that they would have with people like Jean Danielou, Louis Bouillet, Henri de Lubac, I mean, the big names who were the fathers of Vatican II. Kind of the whole Reformation of the church that took place, the ressourcement movement, the return to the fathers, return to the sources. All this was done precisely in that thick soup of culture in France, that brought Orthodox Catholics and a few Protestants, but initially it was just Orthodox and Catholics. Now, in terms of church life there, for Russians in Paris, there were three paths that you could go. Some chose to remain under the Moscow Patriarchate, under the Russian Orthodox Church, despite obviously the horrors that were going on in Russia. They did that out of a sense of loyalty, certainly not because they supported communism, although there may have been a few plants in the mix. But important people, the Losskys, remained faithful. Anthony Bloom in England, Bishop Basil Krivoshein in Belgium, important scholars, all remained in that stream, while obviously not falling into any kind of communist ideology. The other route was the Russian Church in Exile, ROKOR, which was founded by the Karlovci Synod, which tended to be monarchist, sought a return. I mean, they thought that they would return to Russia. And the result of that, unfortunately, was that they supported Hitler because they thought Hitler would get rid of Stalin and communism. And then a third path was under Bishop Yevlogy, who ended up, finding haven under the ecumenical patriarchate and the Russian exarchate there, which was probably where the majority of people ended up. Boundaries between them, as Vera had said, were not always clear. At times there was open hostility. At times, but for ordinary people, the boundaries were really almost non-existent. But for the committed, it was bad. And here, my father suffered personally from that because many of our relatives ended up on that side, especially after autocephaly, actually. My father's first cousin broke relations with him over autocephaly, saying that we had basically given in to the communists. And that story ends well, by the way, because that cousin came to my father's deathbed in Montreal and made peace. So things do come to a successful, peaceful conclusion. In any case, my father then, grew up in that milieu of the Russian exarchate. He was an altar boy in the cathedral in Paris. He recalled hearing Shalyapin singing in the choir. For those of you who don't know, famous Russian bass. But then as he concluded his studies and got ordained a priest, kind of the future became unclear. What do we do from here? By this time, he had 4 children. I forgot to mention that at age 23, he got married to my mother, whom he had met 6 months earlier on the Paris metro. They knew of each other before. They were both active in the student youth movement and so on. But the first physical meeting between them was actually on the metro. So romance in Paris is nothing new. He soon had 4 children. And in 1959, at the invitation of Father Alexander, he agreed to move to the United States. And I remember talking to him about it and asking him, why did you move to the US? You had a nice career. By then, he was becoming well known as a scholar. He could have made a career very well in France. And the answer he gave me was very interesting. He said, here in France, we've got lots of intellectuals and not too many people. Whereas in America, you have very few intellectuals and lots of people. So he really saw it as a kind of, I mean, that was part of his vision. I mean, this is where he needed to be. And so in October of 1959, we came to America traveling on a ship called the Flandre, landed, Ellis Island was closed then, but we landed in the docks in New York. Timing was unfortunate because my father, who was great up here, kind of was not always too keen on the practical details of life. My mother handled all the finances, all the raising of the kids, while he lived on a different plane. I guess it's probably the best way to put it. So we arrived here in October, not realizing that schools in America start a month earlier. The seminary had no place for us to stay. It was still down on the west side, 537 West, 121st Street. So for the first month, we lived at a house provided to us by Father Paul Schnerle, the Antiochian priest in Brooklyn, until they found a 2-bedroom, dark, dank apartment on 121st Street, the building that the seminary was in. And so the family of 6 moved into that apartment, where we stayed until, thank God, in 1962. So 3 years later, the seminary purchased this property and a house in which they lived until my father retired. He had to learn how to drive. My mother learned it like that. I mean, she already knew it back in France, but he had never driven a car. And I remember Ted Frinsko, who was a student at that time, who later became Father Ted Frinsko, ended up in Alaska, who was a veteran, so older gentleman, teaching my father how to drive. My father would come back home smiling ear to ear. I mean, I did great. And Frinsko, Ted Frinsko is just, my father failed his driving test a couple of times. He went through red lights. He had the fortune of living in New York. He always wore a Roman collar. And if a cop, and he committed, I mean, anyway, the cop would come up to the car, look at the collar, "Oh, sorry, Father," and walk away. To the end of his life, I mean, getting into a car with him was rather scary. Now, I will not go into all the details about all the responsibilities that he had at the seminary. Those are listed on the biography that you received. He also, as you know, taught at other schools, spent lots of time at Dumbarton Oaks. A lot of it was certainly because of his vision, but a lot of it was simply to survive. Supporting a family of 6 in New York on the salaries that the seminary was paying at that time was impossible. And so, in fact, it's in a sense fortuitous that he was forced to do these things, because this was how he made the contacts that he made, in the academic institutions where he taught, in the places that he lectured. But his ecumenical work, which was all done obviously gratis, was also a very important part of his life. And here, unlike many of his contemporaries, including Father Schmemann, he was never a Western basher. There was this tendency that has existed in Russia, well, especially in Russia, but it's equally bad in Greece, Romania, everywhere you go in the Orthodox world, to blame all of our problems on the other. And he was always adamantly against that. And in his ecumenical work, he paid his dues, because sitting through those meetings can be brutal, it can be painful, it can be very difficult, but if you stick it out, if you stick to your guns, you can be remarkably effective. And I must say, in that way, he was. Now, I'm not going to speak much longer, but I would just like to conclude with kind of what happened toward the end of his life. He retired early. I mean, he was only 65, 66, He was not sick when he retired, although he died 6 weeks later. The last week of actually before his contract at seminary expired, he spent in Russia with Patriarch Alexei on a cruise ship dedicating a monasteries on Lake Ladoga up in northern Russia. And his goal in retirement was to continue writing and to basically to help the Russian church. He had established a very good relationship with Patriarch Alexei and was, kind of ready to go there and help. I mean, he had already done that before at the St. Tikhon Institute, where he delivered those lectures that Vera had mentioned. But obviously his life was cut short by a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer. He died 8 days after diagnosis. Talk about numbers, which we Orthodox love to talk about. And the last words that he said, and I was not there, but Metropolitan Theodosius and Father Paul Laser were there when they came up to Montreal to the hospital to anoint him. His eyes opened and he said, "The Eucharist." And what he was seeing was that icon that you may have seen in the back of the apse of the church, which he commissioned. I mean, because Father Schmemann had died, the building was done, but none of the iconography was done. The Eucharist. And I think that summarizes his vision, I think, that Vera talked about so eloquently. And it's more than Eucharistic ecclesiology, it's life, it's the church. So I think with that, I would like to turn over and give my sister Anna, my younger sister Anna, an opportunity to say a few words as well.
Thank you, Paul. I'm not on the program, so I beg your forgiveness that I'm choosing nevertheless to say a few words about my father. I did not experience him as a scholar the way almost all of you did. I experienced him as a child, and he was my father. And nevertheless, his scholarship had a great effect on me in a number of ways, I would say. My father was not very good at pretending to be interested in things that he thought didn't have value. He was very impatient with intellectual laziness. He knew what he was interested in. He knew what he thought had value. And that's where he focused, as we've already heard from, the amazing speakers, that's where he focused so much passion and attention. He was probably the least superficial person that I know. He did not engage in superficial conversations. He actually kind of didn't know how to do it. He wasn't good at small talk. His pleasures were very simple pleasures, which is why I won't talk long, because keeping you from your food is not something that he would approve of. He liked to eat good meals. He loved the time he spent in our cabin in Canada, in La Belle. Something I know Paul was maybe going to talk about, but didn't get to, going for walks, jumping in the lake. He would, every year, we all 6 of us would load up for a whole summer in Canada, obviously pre-computers, pre-internet, which my father would never have been able to figure out. And at least half of the back of the car was taken up with his boxes of books. He would set them up in a bedroom. It was a very small place. So his study was also my parents' bedroom. And he would work all morning and then come out close to lunchtime and go out and whack some weeds, pretty ineffectually, probably, not a great gardener. Work up a sweat though, and jump in the lake and have lunch and then go back to work. And he loved that life. He really, he didn't gossip about people. He didn't manufacture problems. In that sense, sometimes people would laugh at him, and especially my mother, for being sort of simple in some ways, and that's because the focus that he brought to the things that were important I think made him almost childlike in some other ways, but childlike in fun ways, in ways that, especially now, that I'm past the age that he was when he died, I appreciate more and more, really. And finally, I want to say that the way that he raised us, admittedly, like Paul says, he was not the kind of father who went to your baseball game. He was not, but he was there to answer our questions when we had questions. So, how do you raise children in the Orthodox Church, especially back then when my feeling about him when I went to elementary school just down Scarsdale Road was like, who was that guy who was walking in the long black dress, to go to his office? That was my father. He never shied away from answering questions and never made at least me feel like I was asking an appropriate question. And he also always had a historic answer, as it's already been said. When I would say, why does this happen? Or why does that happen? He knew the answers to those questions. And if they weren't theological, but largely historical, he was not afraid to admit that. He would say, no, we don't have to do it that way. We do it that way because this is how it came up. So it's not like you better do it this way or you're going to go to hell. And the fact that I felt that all of my questions could be answered, even though he didn't always like all of them, and that he never, ever got defensive about it, gave me an appreciation for really the right way to be an Orthodox Christian. And it's something that I have tried to pass on to my children. And, I speak about it a lot with people because I think that openness to dialogue with people who disagree with you as well as with people who agree with you can only get more important as time passes. So thank you for giving me the time.
Thank you, Dr. Paul. Thank you, Dr. Anna. If I was able to keep my emotions away during my speech now at the very end, I became very emotional. I think this evening, the tribute that we were able to put together tonight, it is a beautiful, beautiful moment.